Hey everyone, ELD here. Welcome to Magic Rules, where we are talking about really nerdy interactions in the rules that may make the difference between winning and losing. Our examples today, that is certainly the case. It's got some excellent, well, one excellent play and one just bone-shattering, devastating misplay, both relating to searching zones. So in Magic, there are public zones and hidden zones. I almost just said private zones. That's if your opponent's searching your private zones, I cannot help you with that. However, when you are searching a hidden zone, your opponent doesn't get to see those cards. So if you have artifacts or enchantments in your deck, who can say, really? Like, they don't get to see it. So, for example, in Light and Tutor, if you were playing it and you decide not to find an artifact or enchantment, you can just fail to find. And that's because it has that criteria. And you might say, well, why would you ever want to do that? Well, let's say maybe you had like brainstormed or you knew the top card of your library and it wasn't going to win and you're dead next turn. You could actually, in Light and Tutor, shuffle your library and then possibly draw a live card, assuming that, you know, an artifact or enchantment wouldn't save you. Otherwise, you just grab it. But if you need to draw like a Supreme Verdict or something, you could at least get one live draw in a situation where somebody else wouldn't get that shuffle and they'd just lose the game. Now, of course, that is because it has that criteria. Your opponent can't prove that you don't have an artifact or enchantment in the deck. So that's the way Magic has handled that rule. I've heard of other card games where you have to show your deck to a judge or you have to show your opponent that you don't have those cards and you're not allowed to fail to find. But in Magic, that's the rules. Doesn't really matter what's going on in those other games. Now, that does contrast with Demonic Tutor. Here it says search your library for one card or a card. And in that case, as long as you have a card in your library, you do in fact need to find a card. You can't exactly look your opponent in the eyes with a 40-card deck and say, well, I couldn't find a card. But there's 40 of them right there. Obviously, you could find one. But it doesn't have that restriction to it, so anyone will do. So let's get to the actual plays here. The first one was one of the best plays that I've seen a young player make probably ever. It was a young kid playing for the Junior Super Series, and Mono Black Control Mirror was super grindy. There was just a ton of creature removal. You probably weren't going to be able to win with a creature. This is Odyssey block, and you had Cabal Coffers had just been printed, and the deck was just really strong, and Haunting Echoes was potentially a win condition. You could potentially mill your opponent out. The most likely way to win was going to be using Mirari with like a drain life effect, because your Cabal Coffers just ramped up so much mana. You could actually just essentially one-shot your opponent. And the game had gone back and forth, all sorts of garbage cards going into the graveyard, things that weren't really going to be useful. And the player, I believe his name was John, but this is like, 20 years ago, probably 22. Yeah, it's like 22 years ago. Wow. He played Haunting Echoes, and he actually Mirari'd it, targeting himself. And what that did is that allowed him to, he did have to remove the cards in his graveyard, and then he actually went into his library and removed any of the cards that he didn't want to be drawing for the rest of the game. So the dead creature removal, the dead discard spells, because both players were hellbent just drawing off the top. So he basically got all of the blanks out of his deck while also getting rid of a ton of cards from his opponent's deck. And he just drew straight gas for the rest of the game and ran away with it. So that was an example of failing to find, where he was able to use Haunting Echoes to get rid of all of the chaff out of his deck while also leaving in the good cards, the win conditions that were in his graveyard. He did not want to get rid of those. He'd need those for later to wrap it up. So that was a really awesome heads-up play that I literally remember like 22 years later. Good on the kid. I don't remember his name, but just it's up here forever, just that great play. So the other one is a just bone-shattering, devastating misplay, and this was with a surgical extraction. Now, this was actually on camera at one point. I don't remember if the match actually has gone live yet or not. I do have a lot of stuff in the backlog, but a surgical extraction was played as an answer to Uro. Now, this was a really devastating one because surgical extraction says search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name as that card and exile them. Then that player shuffles his or her library. So it's any number of cards. So even though the graveyard is public, normally you can't fail to find when you search a graveyard because it's public information. Your opponent can point to it and say, hey, it's right there. What do you mean you can't find it? However, this says any number. So you actually don't have to remove the Uro. And that's exactly what happened. The opponent played the surgical extraction, checked the hand, got a Uro out of hand, was feeling good about that, searched the library, grabbed the other two, and then accidentally left the fourth one in the graveyard and proceeded to get domed by the recursion as it came back. Even though he had the answer, he didn't play it accurately, and it was probably one of the most devastating, violent misplays that I've ever seen. Well, that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments if there's any other rules interactions that you guys want to see, and we'll see you on the next one.